Yes. We're really happy to have all of you today. This panel is kind of going to go through um, some discussions about the field of South Asian American studies, South Asian American ethnic studies, both on a professional side of like how does one enter this field of like academia, but also what is the activism behind South Asian American studies and establishing these programs on college campuses, and what is like the purpose of South Asian American studies and sort of like advancing our society. Um, so what the video that we were just watching was of the San Francisco state strikes in 1968. Dr. Faluba Grania, who teaches at SFS, San Francisco State University, was unfortunately not able to make it today, but she did offer to make a recording to kind of talk about this strike and what it means in this general context. So I'm going to play her recording right now.
Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I wanted to thank Saket and the students who have worked to put this amazing conference on. It's an honor to have been invited, and I'm really sorry I couldn't make it today. I wanted to just talk briefly about the importance of the student strike at San Francisco State University that took place in the 1960s and that established the field of ethnic studies. Doing so has been nothing short of transformative for higher education. And now for elementary and high schools as well, as struggles are taking place to implement ethnic studies at those levels. South Asian American studies as a field focusing on questions of social justice and centered on an ethnic and racial group, which as we know is incredibly diverse and has a host of its own internal power relations that need reckoning with. South Asian studies owes a great debt to ethnic studies, without which such a field couldn't have been imagined. So I show clips of the strike to students to give them a sense of the struggle that took place for this to happen, and more importantly, to remind students of how much power they have. Some context about the strike is that it took place over the course of 5 months. From November of 1968 to March of 1969, and to date is the longest student strike in US history. Shaping the strike was the empowerment that oppressed people were feeling from civil rights activism and anti-war activism. The catalyst for the strike was that the university kept giving lip service to fund a Black Studies program. When the university escalated attacks against George Murray, a Black professor who they claimed was spreading dangerous messages, the BSU, which is the Black Student Union, called for a school-wide strike until demands were met. Soon, other student groups joined. This included the Latin American Student Organization, the Intercollegiate Chinese for Social Action, the Mexican American Student Confederation, the Philippine American Collegiate Endeavor, La Raza, Native American Students Union, and the Asian American Political Alliance. They actually joined together to form what they called the Third World Liberation Front, or TWLF, and they worked in solidarity with the BSU. Putting their heads together, they decided to put together a list of non-negotiable demands to not only launch a Black Studies program, but to house it in a larger College of Ethnic Studies that was dedicated to centering the experiences of people of color and Indigenous groups, and that would have those groups be in the positions of power to determine governance, funding, hiring, courses, et cetera. So the key word that really was sort of shaping this whole movement and its implementation was self-determination, right? So while not every student joined the strike, most of the campus, including white students, did. So it was very much a cross-racial movement. It was a protracted strike. It took 5 months, during which the police, directed by then Governor Ronald Reagan, used violent tactics to try to squash the movement. This included bringing the tactical squad in from across the state to use the school as part of a training ground to deal with radicals. I think you saw some of the violence in the footage. But in the end, the students won, and we now have the first and still only entire College of Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State University. And it, of course, sparked the growth of ethnic studies across this country. I just want to say, 5 years ago, our college was facing budget cuts, but students had none of it. Drawing inspiration from the 68 movement, they formed a huge movement and protest, and basically called the administration to task, and they won. Our college not only was restored funding, but also we were able to get new hires in fields that are underrepresented in ethnic studies, such as Pacific Islander studies. So with that, I hope that history is inspiring to you, and I think you are all doing amazing work and wish you the best going forward. Okay. Thank you again.
Okay, so again, big props to Dr. Bakrania for agreeing to speak on our panel without actually being able to be on the Zoom call. I think that the Student Strike is such an inspiring story to tell about the kind of collective power that we have to get the kind of education that we want and the education that we need. So now we will get into our panel. I'm really happy to have Dr. Stanley Thangaraj, Sunena Maya, and Sasha Sabherwal all with us today to speak on the topic of South Asian American studies. I think just to start, I'll let them introduce themselves really quickly about, if you just want to talk about like the kind of areas that you're researching or the kind of areas that you study, and I guess like where you're at, maybe also like name and pronouns and that kind of info. Dr. Maya, if you want to start.
Sure. Thank you, Sakit, and thank you to everyone who's organizing this conference. It is so exciting and invigorating for me to see you doing this kind of work. And I'm not just saying it out of politeness. I know that it's really hard during the pandemic and trying to live your life virtually to create spaces to come together collectively to have these kinds of conversations. And given the climate in the nation right now, it's more urgent than ever. So I really applaud you for doing such a wonderful, organized job. So in terms of my own work, I have been working, since I was in graduate school focusing on South Asian immigrant communities in the United States. And particularly, I've been interested, all along in issues of youth culture and second generation South Asian American experiences. After 9/11, my work pivoted to look at the impact of the war on terror and US warfare, as well as the domestic war on terror on the lives of South Asian Muslim communities, including working class South Asian immigrant communities. And as a result of that work, which grew out of political impetus in large part, I also expanded my work to look at the shared struggles of South Asian and Arab American and Middle Eastern communities. In confronting the US empire. So my current project is actually an ethnographic study of Arab-owned small businesses that are struggling with the impact of COVID as essential businesses that have remained open during the lockdown. And most of the small grocery stores that I've been focusing on in Oakland, where I live, are actually Yemeni owned. And so I've been looking at the experiences of these Yemeni Americans who are trapped between the war at home in Yemen and the pandemic and the crisis here. Oh, and I should also just note that I am speaking from Ohlone land in Oakland, and my pronouns are she, her. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maya. Sasha Sabherwal, if you want to go next.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to Sakit and Maya for organizing this incredible panel. And I feel so fortunate to be on this panel with Dr. Myra and Dr. Thangaraj, because they are scholars that I so much admire and have included in my syllabi as I teach and think about my academic career going forward. I'm definitely the most junior person on the panel, and I'm really grateful to be here. I am currently a PhD candidate in American Studies and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Yale University. And my research interests are broadly in transnational migration and diaspora, thinking about empire and colonialism, and specifically around the racialization of religion. So my dissertation research focuses on the Sikh diaspora in the Pacific Northwest. And I think about the kind of ways that gender and caste hierarchies are remaking this diasporic community. And my work has been primarily ethnographic. So I've spent a lot of time living in Vancouver, British Columbia, and then on the US side in Washington and in places like Bellingham and Seattle. So I've spent a lot of time kind of thinking about the Pacific Northwest as an important region in South Asian American history, and also in kind of thinking about regionalism and this idea of critical regionalism, which I'll maybe talk a little bit more about as we get deeper into the panel. My pronouns are she and her.
Thank you. And Dr. Thangaraj, if you want to finish off the intros.
Thank you everyone for all the work that you did to make this possible. At this moment, I also want to say that as an Asian American scholar, that I extend my support and act in solidarity with my larger Asian American community, especially the East Asian American community. And raised in Atlanta and writing about Atlanta, at this moment, I also want to say that I grieve and mourn with my family in Atlanta. So I go by he, him, his, and I started graduate school hoping to study something I termed ritual face, where I look at the South Asian American party scene, especially Bhangra, the Ras Garba. And I got to graduate school and my mentor handed me a book and it was titled Bases in the House. And I said, oh, damn it, there goes that project. This book is so good, I'm not even gonna try to walk in the footsteps of this scholar, no way, And it was Dr. Sunaina Myra. And so when I started graduate school, one of my mentors was a collegiate tennis player, and I consider myself an athlete of some sort, right? And he and I would play tennis, and after every match we played, he asked me, why don't you do something about sport? And I started talking about something called Indo-Pak basketball. And that's how I got started. And my first book project looks basically at the politics of diasporic and national citizenship through Indo-Pak basketball leagues across the US and Canada. And looking specifically at what are the politics of these leagues that can claim and really extend what citizenship is and how we practice it locally, while also making it palatable within the sporting realm that excludes so many other communities, queer, women, racialized others, and classed others. And so that was what my first project was on. And then I lived in Nashville for a while, and the largest Kurdish community is in Nashville. And so for me, I'm really interested in looking at the intersections between race, class, gender, sexuality, and cultural citizenship. And in this sense, I wanted to look at a community that's stateless, but also that came mostly as refugees, right? What are those terms of belonging? And so through that, I've been able to study the diverse Kurdish community, their politics of race, and how both of my projects look to challenge how we think about race as black and white, but also engaging with how black and white are used in our communities as well as in Kurdish communities. And with that, it would be such a disservice for me not to mention that Sasha is also doing the work that's setting the field, right? Like, we have to remember that these modest PhD candidates are often the ones that are breaking ground on the stuff that we've always wanted to study and have never conceptualized it. So I thank you, Sasha, and really honored to be here.
Thank you all so much for your intros. First of all, I'm so taken aback by how loving this South Asian American studies community is. We were gassing each other up since even before we started this panel. I'm gonna go into like a question for each of our panels, and then we'll open it up to audience questions and just general questions. If you want to submit a question for any of our speakers, please DM Nandini. She's gonna send a message in the chat in a minute or two. So you can just DM her and we will ask you a question. So I'll start with Dr. Maya again. You work both as an academic and an activist in some really important campaigns around like immigration and human rights. Do you think you can talk about what taking on both of those roles mean to you? And like, how does your role as a South Asian Americanist kind of complement your role in these activist spaces?
Yeah, I was so happy you asked me that question and that I get to kind of discuss this with all of you. By the way, is the sound okay from my end? Is it good? Great. My response is actually that, to me, I don't see these as two separate roles. So being in the field of South Asian American studies and being engaged in social movements, to me, are actually part of the same project. And so as a scholar who's working in the tradition of ethnic studies, which as you just saw in that YouTube video, was founded through political organizing and through challenging US imperialism and challenging the war in Vietnam. We must remember that, as noted in that video clip, that it was actually the war in Vietnam that was fueling a lot of the student activism and outrage, particularly in Asian American communities at that time. And so for me, being an ethnic studies scholar actually entails a political commitment to knowledge as liberatory and not just for the sake of knowledge production. And on that note, my department at UC Davis actually was founded very soon after the establishment of ethnic studies at San Francisco State and UC Berkeley in the early 70s. And people don't know that. So I'm part of this genealogy of ethnic studies scholars that actually see their work as embedded in social movements. And so it's the part of the same role for me. And so one quick thing that I wanted to say, because I know that this was a question that you or others had posed, Saket, is that it's important to note that the establishment of ethnic studies included the obviously organizing of Asian American activists, including West Asian American activists. People don't know that, in fact, the strike involved the Iranian Student Association at the time, which was a leftist student group that was challenging US imperialism and the Shah in Iran. And so they were actually part of the Third World Liberation Front at San Francisco State. And so, for me, as I said, after 9/11, it became really imperative to look at the impact of the war on terror and the violations of civil rights and human rights of Muslim American communities. And in doing so, I was also engaged with groups in the East Coast and also in the Bay Area that were challenging state-sanctioned violence against Muslim Americans. And I was part of coalitions with Arab American and Middle Eastern activists. And so my work since then has also tried to challenge the boundaries of the field to consider West Asians who not just geographically, but also politically are part of the same project in ethnic studies, but have long been on the margins. And so, given the limited attention paid to Afghanistan, I was also very concerned in my previous research to look at the Afghan community and the ways in which they have tried to challenge the longest war in US history, which is still ongoing technically, by the way, in Afghanistan, as well as, of course, the latest war in Iraq and then the ongoing occupation in Palestine.
Thank you so much for sharing. I love how we keep on going back to this point that ethnic studies is something that was fought against like these white supremacist institutions to get it, to get this education. And I also really appreciate your work in bringing in West Asian studies into the fold. I definitely agree. Asian American studies as a field does seem to be like in of itself never seems to be very diverse within the different communities represented. I want to next pass it to Sasha Sabherwal. So a lot of your current research falls on like intersections of race and gender, religion and caste when you're studying Sikh diaspora. So do you think that any of these intersections are missing in the field of South Asian American studies now? And how could students better incorporate those discussions in their inquiry?
So I started this project because I grew up in a Punjabi kind of diaspora in Southern California. And I was always interested in the idea of, my mom, she always went to the Gurdwara, the Sikh temple, and she always went to a mandir, like a Hindu temple. And there's this way in which religion had this more spiritual dimension to how it was practiced in our house, how we thought about it. And I was kind of always very much like had this naive sense of religiosity in kind of South Asian communities, especially coming from Punjab. And I decided to move to Vancouver because there's a huge Punjabi community there. I don't know if folks have been to Vancouver, but Surrey is kind of this hub. It's affectionately known as the kind of Bind. It's kind of a village. So there's this affect in Surrey. The kind of spaces that are produced there are very different, very concentrated community. And that's when I realized my naive sense of religion in kind of Punjab was very much tainted by a kind of Hindu whitewashing of religiosity. And that's really where I understood the impact of religious violence, specifically around 1984, thinking about kind of Sikh experiences, the ways that religious violence kind of lives into the present and makes and reshapes the diaspora. So when I got there, this was kind of what my project was, is thinking about religion in this more diffuse way, thinking about how religion is produced in places like beauty parlors, restaurants, kind of in, intimate spaces in people's homes. But something that happened when I got there is every conversation I had was about caste. So this was early 2019, and every interview that I was doing, people were interested in talking to me about caste. So in Punjab, caste is different than, for instance, what it might be like in other kind of Hindu majority states. So it's mostly around land ownership and this, notion of Jat culture, Jat being the land owning caste in Punjab, was really prominent in Surrey and Vancouver, and Jat music was the mainstream music. And going back to Professor Myra's work around kind of South Asian cool, Desi cool, hip hop, this idea of Jat cool was something that was so pervasive. And so, I mean, caste was just inevitable for the project. And I guess it just goes to show when you're doing research, you might go in with a preconceived idea of what the dissertation might look like, but really it shifts and it changes depending on, what matters to the community. And these are the kinds of issues that really mattered. And one thing that I was really interested in is there's this idea of apne, which is our community. And I was really interested in who is it that you mean when you say apne. And there's definitely a caste inflection in this kind of categorization of who belongs into this community. So I started thinking about kind of caste, ideas about Jat pride, Jat culture, the kind of mainstreaming of this kind of idea of who belongs within the Punjabi culture. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier, is like thinking about regions. And I don't know if I don't know if anyone wants to think more about this kind of concept, but I'm really interested in thinking about both the Pacific Northwest as a particular borderland region, but also Punjab as a kind of regional diasporic formation. And Gayatri Gopinath talks a little bit about this and kind of thinking about Kerala as a kind of regional formation and what that might do to push against the conception of, the category South Asian American, how the region might fit into these kinds of ideas about who belonging within this category and the kind of limitations and possibilities of the category South Asian American. So I don't know if Saket, this answers your question, but I was thinking a lot about this piece that we read in the course that I taught that Saket was part of, South Asians in America. And Professor Myra, it was part of a kind of collective who wrote this piece called Deprivileging Positions, Indian Americans, South Asian Americans, and the Politics of Asian American Studies. And this was written in early 2000. And I was just returning to the piece and really realizing how much it still resonates in 2021. 2 decades later, some of the questions that were asked in the piece are so relevant. And I'm happy to share the essay with folks in this section, but I mean, I don't know if that is helpful, but I think it's interesting to wonder how much has changed in the field of South Asian American studies, and sort of, I guess Sakit's question about caste, gender, kind of intersectional approaches has been happening, but I'm wondering if we've come to some kind of resolution about some of these earlier questions about the state of the field.
I really appreciate your conversations, especially in centering caste in your research, and how like you realized that that was kind of an inevitable discussion. It reminds me of a lot of what Christina Thangaraj, who was a keynote speaker, was talking about. How, well, she was actually kind of talking about how it's not only that it needs to be like in the front of our minds, but it needs to be like actively talked about and actively put by people doing this kind of research in the center of like their papers and their works to like really like move forward in this caste liberation struggle. So I really appreciate your conversation. Next, I'll pass it to Dr. Thangaraj. So your study on Asian American sporting cultures and the experiences of Kurdish American communities really help us better understand social phenomena and like the kinds of power structures behind them. Do you think you can speak a little bit about why this understanding is important? Like, what is that kind of, I guess, like generally I'm asking, like, what is kind of the use of ethnic studies and why is it really important for us to understand?
Yeah, thank you. And before that, just to go back to what Sasha said, I think Sasha and I are so thrilled to be here because we know we stand on the shoulders of a giant. And Sunaina is just so kind and humble and generous. So I'm sorry, I am going to be fanboying the whole time, just in case anybody had any doubts of what was going to happen. But back to your question. So my project, and to think about ethnic studies, is to look at how citizenship and belonging are on multiple fronts, both diasporic and nationals in the plural, meaning that a transnational analysis is necessary to understand the ways in which we negotiate race in the US. So in my own project, I look at how racial belonging and also how racialization is a gendered and sexualized experience that is both against and through the black-white racial logic that also aims to really do the work of stressing difference within the South Asian American diaspora, right? Where oftentimes that becomes a bounded unit. We don't think about the ways in which it is always messy, but what are the terms by which it is consolidated and what are those conditions, right? And so in my project looking at Indo-Pak basketball, I look at the performances of belonging that involve many and shifting categories of race, gender, sexuality, and class. And why sport? Because sport is such a major part of our socialization. And yet, South Asian American studies and Asian American studies fail to address this, right? How many times do we need Jeremy Lin? How many times do we need a spelling bee champion to showcase that we have a wide spectrum of practices of sport that are so critical to how we claim belonging or disbelonging in various spaces? And so my project, and thinking about ethnic studies, what are the ways that we want to be recognizable, right? What are the terms of our visibility? And in particular, the practices in Indo-Pak basketball and South Asian American masculinity was a challenge to our racialization as nerds and the emasculation. But yet what I want to showcase is that that challenge, it does not operate free of power. And ethnic studies allows us to center power, not only in how power operates between categories, but our own ways of knowing that comes through structures of power. And to look at how our categories of exclusion become foundational in creating new categories of belonging, that we do not dismiss the category of race, gender, sexuality, and class, but reuse it and appropriate it and ask it to do different work to create new racial hierarchies. So we are not dismantling power, but rather articulating new formations of power that might not free us all. And in Indo-Pak basketball, that meant leading to performances of like swag, right? And we don't talk enough about ethnic studies and desires and pleasures and being able to be the baller and shot caller, like, oh man, I'm ready to play. But yet, what does that play mean when it's done through a sporting masculinity that requires the exclusion of Black men, gay masculinities, and women? So in particular, my work looks at how racializations, as I said, are gendered and sexualized. Thus, it forces us to come to terms with not only the US racial logic, but also South Asian idioms that are prevalent in our diasporic community, such as Kallu, Gora, and Chapte, along with sexualized slurs such as Chaka and Gandu. Why do Muslims and Sikhs stress ideas of biological superiority through the colonial concept of martial races, like we're tougher than other men in these sporting spaces, right? That's something that's a transnational, transhistorical process. And how is this incorporated and used in US popular culture? Thus, some of the teams I played with and studied, like the Chicago team Untouchables, which is mostly Kerala Malayali Christians who have a history of connections to conversion and with relation to untouchability, to also the Untouchables as the Chicago film about Prohibition era, Chicago and a certain type of gangster masculinity. And then the team I played with Outcast, right? So it allows us to see how these social formations are negotiated through various forms of popular culture that really allow us to showcase how we bring ideas and are constantly circulating between South Asia and the diaspora. And finally, my work on Kurds, just like what you can see with Dr. Myra, our projects are often very local. I like to be in the communities that I'm doing the work. And it started out of my activism work with immigrant and refugee communities in Nashville, which is one of the major destination sites for refugees in the US, because they have over 600 churches who are sponsors. And so through that, I got to understand how they manage the Bible Belt US South and the Black-white racial logic, while challenging many national and nation state descriptions of race. So ethnic studies allows us to understand how race works as both the process of affinity and repudiation that does not need only the Black-white other. And in the case of Kurds, it's a sense of affinity with Indians to say, oh man, we share a lot. We are part of the Indo-European language family. You love biryani, I make good biryani, we're all good, right? But it also requires a certain sense of creating space from Arabs. And at this time of the global war on terror, what do these geopolitical commitments then mean in diasporic spaces where, again, belonging also comes with various processes of exclusion?
Thank you so much. You made so many great points, Dr. Thangaraj. I really appreciate you noting that ethnic studies is transnational, that it doesn't help anyone to just focus on the US and focus on the entire migration process within it and the histories of those like homelands as well. Also your intersectional lens, bringing in gender and sexuality, and how then just like you can't separate them from other racial identities. I think those are really important. The next question I'm going to ask is for everyone or anyone who would like to speak on it. But I know a lot of the organizing around ethnic studies was kind of like somewhat led by like Black and Indigenous students and Black and Indigenous leaders, definitely in coalition with a lot of these Asian Americanists, but also like a lot of the like founding racial texts that we even read in like Asian American studies classes were written by those Black and Indigenous authors. So I'm wondering, how do we kind of like properly acknowledge and respect their experiences when thinking about South Asian American studies? How do we kind of like incorporate their their experience and their writing on racial formations in the United States in our own research? Yeah, anyone who would like to speak on that?
Sakit, I don't mind, starting off and then seeing what my colleagues think, because I was very struck by that question, because in fact, it's interesting for me being located here in the University of California and teaching to my students in Asian American studies. I think if anything, they grapple more with trying to acknowledge the role that Asian intellectual thought and political thought played in the ethnic studies movement and in the Third World Liberation Front strike. So from my perspective, and I'm curious what Sasha and what Stan feel, that in fact, there is a great deal of emphasis on, acknowledging, the Black Panthers. I'm sitting here, as I said, in Oakland. It's also Ohlone land, where the American Indian movement conducted its occupations, and Alcatraz is in the virtual background. You can see the bay behind me. And so, of course, it's incredibly important. There's no question in trying to understand and, emphasize Black power movements and indigenous movements in the founding of ethnic studies. But my students have a much harder time acknowledging that Maoism had a huge influence on the movement and on the Black Panthers because of some of the anti-communist and anti-socialist, trends in Asian immigrant and refugee communities here. And in the context of thinking about, South Asian American thought, I mean, that's why I wanted to acknowledge the role of the Iranian Student Association, which my colleague and friend Manije Muradian has been documenting in a book that she's going to be publishing on the Iranian Student Association's organizing during that period, is that there were also South Asian activists in Berkeley, right here, and also in other parts of the country that were actually following in the legacy of the Ghadar revolutionary movement on the West Coast, and actually, engaging in a tradition of, South Asian leftism and Indian Marxism. And they were maybe perhaps smaller in number, but they were part of the movement. So I think the challenge for us is, to be very honest, that thinking about this from the perspective of a community that in many segments is very conservative. I'm not talking about the South Asian community, where these legacies are not known. So I have actually more work to do in trying to teach my students about the legacy of Ghadar and South Asian anarchism and socialism than I do in trying to get them to acknowledge the importance of Black power movements. I think indigeneity does fall off the radar in my experience, but I think that, going off of what Stan just talked about, I do think there is a way in which race politics in the US and the Black-white binary, and also I think a certain kind of anxiety around solidarity in a moment of identity politics makes it very difficult for my Asian American students to think about a politics of position that is not a politics of identity, as Angela Davis once said. So I'll just end there, but that's my own perspective from where I stand.
Thank you so much for your insight there, Dr. Myra. I definitely agree that I guess we do need to focus a lot on Asian Americans and our role in these kind of ethnicities movements as well. Dr. Thangaraj, do you want to speak on that?
I can't thank Dr. Myra enough. And one of the things I think we have to acknowledge is that there was always collaborative spaces, right? In the very beginnings of these movements, there was incredible cross-pollination and sharing of resources that helped Asian American movement, like the ways in which historically Black universities gave access to their presses to be able to print this stuff that was part of the social movements for Asian Americans and Native Americans. Right. And so there is something where there's a much greater history that creates anxiety in how we think about ethnic studies that is not already fluid. Right. And so when we think about ethnic studies, I think that's what we three as scholars in the academy are trying to do, is to disrupt the idea of it as a knowable thing, but rather to think about what are the ways in which we can unknow it that can create much greater possibilities of collaboration that link not just in the present, but as always part of our histories that have not been really articulated enough, right? And so that's where I think, for me, when I think about your question, I think about, like, how do we also properly acknowledge the scholarship that works for us as well? Right. And that's where I think it's so critical that we do not create a canon for South Asian American studies that already comes from a certain political moment and a certain historical moment and certain conditions, right? Like, how can we do the work that might address the silence rather than how do we do the work that adds to what's already been done, right? And I think that's a really difficult question. So for me, as a cisgendered heterosexual man, queer theory, queer of color critique, and queer diaspora critique have been the most phenomenal ways to engage with that silence and that gap and that refusal, right? And so for me, that has been very helpful. But when I think about this, I also wanted, one of the things I wanted to raise before the session was done was to also say, we have to talk about Kashmir, right? And there is such silence in how in South Asian American studies, we do not address that enough, right? And what is being done against the people in Kashmir is deplorable, and a clear statement of how at times our South Asian American communities are very intricately implicated and should be ashamed of the violence back home, right? And so for me, acknowledging means also acknowledging this violence that goes across these transnational circuits, that is part of this global attack on Muslim communities, and the ways in which Sikh communities are thrown outside of the categories of belonging because they're not Hindu enough, right? And so there are all these other questions that I think once we do that and we establish collaborative multiracial fronts, we can really get to what Dr. Meyer said about the Gadar Party and look at the ways in which the new scholarships, such as Sasha's work, Saista Patel, Manan Desai, and other scholars are doing the work that's addressing that silence, and we need that work.
I'll just quickly add that that is so inspirational. Thank you so much for thinking about the kind of unknown, the uncertain, pushing against what might be the potential of futurities. And I was thinking a lot about kind of Blackness, how we're talking about Blackness within South Asian studies, and Isabel Wilkerson's new work, Caste and its Global Discontents. And I'm wondering if, it might be useful to think about the nuances. There's a lot of slippage happening in the ways that we are thinking about Blackness, and a lot of ways, simplifications around kind of making parallels between, for instance, the Black Panthers and the Dalit Panthers. And I'm wondering if in our kind of, as we think about the new kind of field of South Asian American studies, one way to think about what we might do going forward might be to think about the kind of more nuanced ways in which we're thinking about Blackness and global Blackness, and articulating the kind of linkages between these two kind of fields, and trying to do something different than maybe perhaps the kind of ways that we have drawn these clear-cut parallels, and try to kind of make these reductive assumptions about caste, Blackness. And I hear this a lot from people in my kind of throughout my field work, a lot of these kind of parallels being made and just casually trying to relate experiences of Blackness to Dalit experiences. And I wonder how we might think about complexity there, and how we might think about these kind of simplifications in more nuanced terms.
Thank you so much for responding to the question. I really appreciate, especially your point about, I guess, problematizing that comparison. This is actually something our I'm plugging our very next panel as well, on tech discrimination. Has people who are going to talk about the Cisco case, and what caste discrimination has been looking like in the United States. And this is actually something that they're going to bring in as well. What this, or I guess how other people feel about that comparison, and how to properly understand that. So, okay, also, Dr. Thangaraj, I really appreciate you bringing in Kashmir, because we got an audience question about that as well. So I just wanted to loop that in. They asked, the field of South Asian American studies has a very hegemonic Indian view of the situation in Kashmir, and folks don't usually address the issue of settler colonialism in the land. Are there any scholars doing this kind of work? And what are ways in which we can work on decolonizing perspectives on the occupation of Kashmir? I think Dr. Thangaraj, since you've spoken it already, if you want to build off of that.
Sure. I think one of the scholars that's doing amazing work is Dr. Hafsa Kanjwal, who is at Lafayette College, doing brilliant work on Kashmir. Then another person who's doing fantastic work on it is Dr. Mona Bhatt, And and then yep, exactly what Dr. Myra wrote, atharzia as well. And so there is great work being done within it. And some of these connections are also being made by folks like Dr. Shaista Patel as well, where they're looking at how can we talk about settler colonialism as always something about Asian America, and not think about Asia and South Asia as sites of settler colonialism, right? And so it's forcing us to rethink this, right? Just like the ways in which ethnic studies should force us to think about race as not something that happens on US shores, but rather what is this global circulation, colonial legacies, post-colonial constructs, right, that influence us before we arrive here, right? And that continue to shape us even when we're here. And I think those are some names that come to mind. And I think engaging with their work allows us to see how when we think about the categories we use, such as India and Pakistan and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and Bhutan and Tibet and Nepal, what are the ways in which we're stuck in this ideas of blood ties and purity that is necessary to construct the nation that always involves the exclusion of various other communities? And how have Kashmiris been caught in this, right? In a battle that is disempowering on many fronts, right? It's not that they're Muslim, it's also because they're Kashmiri and they have various other legacies and ties to land.
Sakit, can I just add one thing to that? Because I really appreciated Stan bringing it up. And I do think Stan is right that this is an issue that has been silenced for a long time. I mean, there's a kind of, there are multiple layers of silencing. It's because South Asian American studies was always so marginal. So people didn't even know the first thing about what was going on in South Asia. People thought South Asia is Southeast Asia. I mean, not too long ago, I had colleagues who told me they were very interested in my work in Southeast Asia, like academics, and also students. But it's also, of course, because of the hegemony of a certain kind of dominant Indian nationalist position. That said, I want to point out that in South Asian American studies, the way the field developed, and Sasha was kind enough to cite that article that I and Pawan Dhingra and Jaideep Singh and Rajni Shrikant, other people, when we were graduate students and junior faculty, were thinking about it. I mean, the people who were involved in the early years in developing the field were definitely South Asian leftists, mostly Indian leftists, I want to acknowledge. However, that even on the Indian left, the Kashmir issue was not spoken about. It was actually unspeakable. And I had so many arguments with Indian leftist comrades of mine who did not want to talk about the issue of Kashmir as an issue of the biggest military occupation in the world or the Kashmiri right to self-determination. And then, of course, with the work of Arundhati Roy and others and Kashmiri, people themselves and scholars, you've noted it's changed. But as with the question that Sasha brought up about being concerned about parallels, one thing I'm also noticing, actually now I'm seeing more work that's trying to connect Kashmir and Palestine. And as someone who kind of works both in Indian diaspora studies and is kind of somewhat engaged with Indian studies, not centrally, but is engaged with Palestine diaspora studies, I'm also cautious about making too quick analogies, and I think there has been a tendency on the ground amongst activists in trying to make these connections. Now, Atharzia actually and Mona Bhan discuss this in their work. And so I think there's good scholarship that is thinking about the nuances of the ways in which the Indian state is not like the Israeli state. And so I think that is one point, but I do really want to acknowledge also that there are these sub-imperial formations, and with Hindu supremacy and right-wing Hindu nationalist movements, as well as with reactionary movements in other faith-based communities, whether they are, Christian or Muslim, we also see conservative trends in all of these communities because they're all humans. So I actually also want to acknowledge there are issues, for example, within Pakistan, or the repression of Baloch nationalism that's been brutal, with the support of the US, that Pakistan at the behest of the CIA has suppressed, movements there as well. There are issues in Afghanistan of anti-Shia violence. I mean, there are issues in Sri Lanka and so on and so forth. And that if we get away from our Indian lens, which has dominated the movement, or a liberal multiculturalist lens, that maybe we can grapple with these issues. So I really appreciate your bringing that up, Stan.
Sasha Sabherwal, if you also wanna speak on this issue. If not, we can that's totally fine, and we can move on to the next topic.
I'll just add that you know, issues around Khalistan are very important in kind of my particular fieldwork. Also, its relationship to thinking about sovereignty, to thinking about kind of radicalism and ideas about kind of the Indian state. And Khalistan, especially in the kind of Pacific Northwest, is important because there was the Air India bombings from Canada, and BC is an important site in the making of this. And so these questions about sovereignty, about land, about autonomy, and are related to kind of thinking about settler colonialism within the context of Canada, which the formation of settler colonialism is so significant to the kind of ways that race operates. The racialization of Punjabis is happening kind of alongside the racialization of Indigenous peoples in that area. So I mean, I'll just say this has been really fascinating. I mean, just this conversation, I don't necessarily have an answer, but just thinking a lot about kind of Kashmiri autonomy, Khalistani autonomy, and the ways that the Indian state is labeling these kind of as radical anti-intellectual movements, also as a labeling as like a terrorist movement. So for instance, just the past few months, a new organization formed in BC called Poetic Justice Foundation, and they were tied to a lot of this kind of Khalistani propaganda and the ways that they're being kind of written out of the story because of their affiliation with Khalistan. So there's a simplification that happens, especially in the diaspora. It's very black and white. It's very much like pro-Khalistan, anti-Khalistan. There's no nuance there. And I think a lot of that is happening, you know, in the kind of Kashmir conversation, in conversations about the Northeast in India, and thinking about those in the diaspora, I think is really important.
Yeah, I really appreciate these points. Definitely understanding settler colonialism in South Asia, I think is super important. How do you like center Kashmiri and also like advocacy people's voices, Khalistanis. I do want to note tomorrow's Politics of Dissent panel has Ata Zia. It also has some Baloch activists like Rafiul Kakar and Amar Jan from Pakistan who are going to be speaking on these issues, which could be a good place another good place to learn more. We have very little time left. So I think we're just gonna ask one last question. If you could give like one piece of advice for a student who is interested in South Asian American studies and working like this kind of professional academic field, are there any lessons that you have learned that you would love to pass on? Again, whoever wants to jump in first.
That is the most unfair question I've heard. Jeez. Oh my. Oh my. Okay. I think the closest thing I might be able to come to that is to think about what does your work do to open up other spaces, right? What have you done that is not fully complete? And that's where I think all three of us as panelists will acknowledge our books and our scholarship is for one particular moment and for certain types of historical and political conditions. So for anyone doing work on South Asian American studies, don't be afraid to push the envelope, right? Just because it's not there doesn't mean it shouldn't be studied. It means it hasn't been studied, right? That there is something there that's really important about the absence, right? So for me, after I finished my book, I'm like, oh my goodness, all this great stuff is coming out on caste. And I'm like, I didn't even do that. It's like, damn it, I didn't do caste. And so, so for me, I think one of the things for us to do as we move forward is to think about the last question, the third question you emailed us about, you know, how do we make sure our understandings of these fields are expansive and don't leave anyone out? So I said, who is Indian also needs to be acknowledged, right? How is Indian constructed along the mythologies of Aryanness and Brahmin supremacy? And we need to acknowledge the folks of Nagaland and Assam and places in Northeast India and their diaspora in the US that is not at all engaged. And South Asia has to be thought outside the binary rubrics of India, Pakistan, and Hindu Muslim. And we need to account for our diasporas, especially that come from Africa, the Caribbean, and from other places, and how they stand in relation to the hegemony of professionals from India. And thus I ask that we incorporate scholarship on Sikhs, Jains, indigenous communities, Sri Lankans, Nepalis, Tibetanese, Bhutanese, and so many. In the process, we have to examine the relationship of all of our communities to the category of South Asia, white supremacy, caste supremacy, capitalism, and nationalism. We have to attend to it in important ways, how our gender presentation and sexuality work in relation to the dominant understandings of South Asian America. And in this sense, when it comes to Muslim America and Muslim South Asian America, don't forget about the monopoly of Sunni Islam in thinking about South Asian American Muslim communities, right? And so some of those are the things I would push for. And also to think about how you can see the love fest here. That's because I'm in the presence of incredibly generous scholars. But as a whole, working with the South Asian American community is incredibly difficult. It is a space of such haterade, right? And it is a space that's hard to manage, and the mentorship isn't consistent. The support for your work isn't consistent. Trying to organize South Asia as a section and South Asian American section is easier than herding cats. And I just coached youth soccer today for kids who are 4. I can herd them better than I can herd South Asian America. So we have to think about what are our collaborations that can make it easier for us to really get together.
Just to add on Stan's point about the haterade, as someone who is young, and the gendering of my research, and especially being in religious spaces around uncles who are very much kind of trying to gatekeep, very much trying to maintain a kind of orthodoxy about kind of religion and religious practice, it is hard, and it's hard to do interviews, it's hard to be taken seriously. But on the flip side of that, there is this new kind of movement. For instance, Kareem Kubchandani's work around critical auntie studies is really incredible for me as someone who worked with an advisor who I found to be, someone very supportive, very generous. And she was an auntie figure for me. And I think there's something that's happening within the field, and something you can see here around care, around support, and around kind of building together that is also happening simultaneously. Not to deny that it's really hard to do this work and hard to navigate the kind of heterogeneity within the field, but also that there is kind of this very dynamic, really engaging and exciting kind of new direction that people are thinking about academia and thinking about like auntie pedagogies, for instance, and auntie methodologies and sort of what that might look like. And I find that really exciting.
Sakit, do you need to close off, or should I make a point for like a minute?
If you would like to make a point, that's totally fine. After this, we will be going into the icebreaker section.
Right, which I think is very important, because I think you all need to have a more open conversation and not just listen to us. But I would just say that I agree with everything that has just been said. And in fact, if anything, responding to what both Sasha and Stan have been saying, that I think at the moment that I entered South Asian American studies, when the field was not even really named as such and acknowledged, I think there was greater solidarity. I mean, that article that, Sasha cited, I mean, it had like 6 co-authors. Like we all decided we just had to do it as a group. Like we just would not do it individually. And it was crazy editing. But I do think that, as academia has become even more insanely competitive, as job security has become more intense, I do also want to acknowledge, for those who are trying to enter South Asian American studies, not to lose sight of the fact that, institutionalization and the politics of recognition can actually be very destructive, and that, we have to be very wary of the ways in which, the institutionalization of the field is both necessary in terms of having resources and having space, but how, it's not the end point. And I know that's hard for people who are looking for employment and job security. But I also think that as Stan said at the beginning, to make sure that we're not just focusing on the things we think are known or that we need to know, but I think the spaces of, kind of solidarity amongst one another, aunties, uncles, cousins, bhaiyas, or whatever you want to call it, like that is so important. Like Stan is one of the few people who every time he writes to me, asks me how my daughter is doing. Like, I mean, so few academics check in that personal way, not even, gendered female academics. And I really appreciate the space you're trying to create in SAYI this year, and I hope it continues.
Thank you all so much. This was such an amazing and inspiring panel. If people in the chat want to like either unmute or write in the chat any words of appreciation for our panelists today, I think we would really appreciate it. Definitely, so many key points that hit home. I'm going to be rewatching this recording later on as well. I'll actually stop the recording now.